We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Hello, my name is Steve Camarota, and this is Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies, a think tank in Washington that examines and critiques immigration and its impact on the United States. I'm the center's director of research. I'm joined today by Dr. Ron Hira. Ron is an associate professor of public policy at Howard University. He is also a research associate with the Economic Policy Institute. Prior to joining Howard, Ron served on the faculty of Rochester Institute of Technology. Dr. Hira's research covers U.S. competitiveness, offshoring, high-skill immigration, and workforce policy. Ron has testified numerous times before Congress about high-skilled immigration and offshoring specifically, and he's also actually worked as an engineer. And we are absolutely delighted to have him here today. Thanks for joining us, Ron.
Thanks for inviting me, Steve.
So there's a lot of issues to cover, but we're going to be talking about everything in your wheelhouse. Professor Hira, you have stated that immigration policy too often conflates immigration, as you put it, and guest worker programs. Can you explain to our listeners sort of just broadly what are the differences?
Yeah, so immigration is permanent residency and or citizenship. So you basically have the same rights as citizens as an immigrant. And that becomes important when we talk about employment and legal status. And that's where the contrast with the guest worker programs go. And they're called guest workers because they're guests in the country as long as they're working under certain conditions. So they're guest workers. If they lose their job, then they're no longer welcome as guests. And so what happens is with guest worker programs, and I'm sure we'll talk about the alphabet soup of these different guest worker programs, those workers have far fewer rights, and importantly, employment rights and legal status rights in the U.S. They're only guests under certain kinds of conditions. And when we're talking about immigration policy, usually people interchange these guest workers with green cards or permanent residency. And that's a big problem because the effects and the impacts on the labor market are different. The way that those people are treated is different. And so we really need to sort of distinguish between them and come up with policies that are good overall and look at those different kinds of impacts.
Yeah, so let's drill down specifically in today's topic, which is more skills-based on skilled immigration. So again, we have these two separate ways of approaching it. One is with permanent immigration, and then we have this temporary. In terms of skills-based immigration or skilled immigration specifically designed to give us access to skilled labor, talk about the biggest and most important. You can just paint with a broad brush if you like. The programs we have both for permanent skilled-based immigration and temporary skilled-based immigration.
So I'll get into the details, but I think there's an important point here to make, and that is that our skills-based system is tilted far too much towards temporary guest worker programs and not enough towards permanent immigration. And there's a variety of reasons for this. Some has to do with the way our permanent immigration system is tilted towards family unification as opposed to employment-based. But really, this is a big problem. We're very reliant in the U.S. on temporary guest worker programs for our skills-based migration as opposed to permanent. Now, in terms of the permanent side, there are skilled people come in through all the different typical channels of permanent immigration, whether through family, through humanitarian refugees, asylees, and even through diversity lottery. But the primary channel, specifically the economic-based focus, is on employment-based permanent immigration green card. So this is where an employer sponsors a worker, a foreign worker, for permanent immigration, and they have control over that process. And there's a preference system within that permanent employment base. We'll call it EB is the acronym for it, for that employment-based permanent immigration system. Now, going to the guest worker programs, which are far larger in number and in scope, we have the largest is the H-1B guest worker program, which is the specialty occupation program for anybody that's got a bachelor's degree or higher, and for a white-collar kind of professions. There's large numbers that come in, both flow and then stay. They can stay up to 6 years. The L1 visa program, there's two varieties there, the L1A for managers and executives, and the L1B for so-called specialized knowledge workers. This is for multinational companies. So these are international companies that have personnel overseas who bring them in, and they can be foreign multinationals or U.S. multinationals, just have to have operations in the U.S., and they'll bring in large numbers of people across in something that's called intra-company transfer. Intra, I-N-T-R-A, means within the company, they're bringing in people. Then there's something called the OPT, which is the optional practical training visa. And that's supposed to be a student visa. It's supposed to be an educational visa that allows people to get some kind of internship type work, but it's really turned into a work visa program, and that's been growing very fast and in large numbers. So that's for international students who are here at a U.S. university. They get the opportunity, in addition to their education, to actually have some work experience on this work authorization visa.
Good. That was a nice summary. I think that'll help a lot of folks who don't know that much about it. So thank you for that. Let's stay a little bit more at the 40,000 foot level and discuss very briefly why we have these programs. Part of it is to allow companies, as you point out, to transfer people within the company to the United States. Think that in a globalized era, that has a certain logic to it. We want corporations to locate here and things like that. But specifically for H-1B visas and even some of the permanent-based green cards, employment-based immigration, the argument is made repeatedly that these programs are desperately needed and they're actually inadequate. There's just not enough people being allowed in. And the chief justification for that is the idea that there is a terrible shortage. Now, you can argue about that word. I don't want to get into that, but just that maybe just say, how about we put it this way, that demand is greatly outstripping supply. The labor market is extremely tight for what, again, are called STEM workers in particular. And to remind our listeners, STEM stands for the categories of science, technology, engineering, and math. So let me ask you, is there evidence of a terrible shortage in STEM workers, that the supply is nowhere near adequate, which is, of course, an argument constantly made?
Everybody who's looked at this, including myself, there's no evidence to support that there's a generalized shortage of STEM workers. And there's no shortage even within certain occupational categories that are often thought to be in short supply, such as engineering or computer occupations, software development. You could look at any number of indicators, but the most important one is wages. And wages have been flat or even declining in many of these occupations. So if you had a shortage, you would, just like if you have a shortage of oil, what happens? The prices go up. You would see, in this case, if you had a labor shortage, wages would go up. That's the price of labor. But I think importantly here that you started the question talking about the rationale, the reason for these programs is to fill gaps when there aren't U.S. workers, when the U.S. labor market, the labor supply is insufficient. It's not sufficient to fill these kinds of jobs. That's when you're supposed to turn to these, whether it's employment-based green cards or to one of the temporary programs. That's the rationale, is that you're intervening in the labor market. You're intervening into the market because there's insufficient supply. And not only insufficient domestic workers, U.S. workers, but even U.S. students who get trained or other workers who get trained to fill those jobs. And so you need to take this radical step, and I think it's a radical step, of actually going and importing foreign workers to fill these gaps. That's the notion. The reality is very different because, in fact, these programs don't require such gaps to exist.
Right. So it seems like when we look at the key indicator of labor shortage or a situation with a very tight labor market, wages don't show evidence of it. I've done some work in this area too, so I just ran a few numbers recently. And looking at, say, 2010 to 2022, we have some pretty good data for STEM workers. And basically, it shows that real wages are actually down for those folks. Inflation, not surprisingly, at least when we look at annualized wages, seems to have actually declined, and inflation hit that group pretty hard, though technology workers generally had done the best. But even there, you find 1.5% growth in annual wages above inflation between 2010 and, say, 2020, before inflation hit. So 1.5% a year is not the kind of pattern we would expect if technology workers, we were just desperately short for whatever reason. Let me touch on a related question. As you know, and I won't bore you with too many statistics, but there are something like 17 million people in the United States who have STEM degrees. That's immigrant, native born, everything. And there are about, usually reckoned, 8 to 9 million actual STEM jobs. So again, does that kind of seeming discongruity between the assertion there are just no Americans who have these degrees or are willing to do this work and the number of people we really need?
Yeah, there's a large number of people who are so-called STEM educated, so they have degrees in STEM, who don't work in STEM occupations. And that might be for a variety of reasons. And some are for good reasons, in the sense that they're managers or they're going to do something different that's high paying or high rewarding. In many cases, it's involuntary, in the sense that they would like a STEM job but can't find one, and so they become a realtor or some other occupation. And of course, within STEM, there are lots of problems of age discrimination. There's underrepresentation of women and many minority groups. So those kinds of indicators, again, should raise your thought process and say, well, if there's a shortage, we shouldn't see these kinds of indications. The other point I would make is that oftentimes, and we hear this from politicians all the time and business leaders, is that young students, young Americans, and I've got a daughter in college, are just not interested in studying STEM, or they're not capable of studying these fields. Well, again, the evidence points to the contrary. In fact, the number of engineering bachelor's degrees is way up. It's at record levels. The number of computer science degrees is way up, way record levels. And what it shows is that U.S. students, that my takeaway from that is that U.S. students are A, interested in these fields, and B, most importantly, they're capable of doing these. They're completing these degrees. They're not just pursuing these degrees. We have a very large talent pool that's being untapped and undertapped, in part because of the importation of foreign workers.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Just as a side, I too have a daughter in college, and she's majoring in data science, so she's certainly extremely capable in mathematics in particular. So it does seem odd, this kind of argument. Why would Americans, a country of our size, not have people who are interested? Now, you're going to have people interested in any number of things, but it seems like everyone gets that these are relatively good paying jobs, and they can be very fascinating and interesting to people. And so it doesn't seem like this isn't a job where you can at least construct an argument. Look, farm work, this is very difficult. The fraction of Americans who have any experience with that is low. So that's a discussion for another day. But at least there you can see that line of argument. But you'd have to sort of construct an argument that Americans, they just despise the idea of working in an office behind a computer or going out and doing engineering work. There's just no evidence of that. And as you say, the number of people with degrees or getting degrees is certainly quite high.
And if I may, I want to add one thing, because I think this is problematic amongst our sort of policy elite. And so here, I mean, the university administrators, the industry folks, the politicians, they're very pessimistic about our young, and I'm an educator, a professor. I'm not pessimistic. Our students, young people, are very capable of doing these things. And so this kind of defeatist attitude that Americans just can't do these jobs, it's just wrong. I mean, on so many levels, and it's sort of self-defeating in a lot of ways along the way. I'd also note that, it's not just wages, it's also working conditions. And there's a very good new book that just came out a few months ago by Professor John Scretany from UC San Diego, University of California, San Diego, called Wasted Education. And in it, he documents the sort of burn and churn model of many technology companies. And what he's talking about is that the working conditions, the job conditions, maybe the wages are good, but the expectations that you're going to be working 18-hour days, and that once you get a new person in, maybe 5 or 7 years down the road, you've burned them out because you've worked them so hard. And so this model, that a labor market model where it's not even, employment for life, it's employment for a few years. You're just going to use up somebody's, productive time. That's, also not an indication of a shortage, right? That's an indication that you've got plenty to choose from. That
right,
the
or else you have to treat people better.
That's right.
Which does get to an interesting point. The way in which the market's supposed to work is if you're not treating people well, then they start to go and do other things because these are pretty talented people. And it's the same way. If you're not paying enough, then wages are supposed to rise. There is this odd notion that if wages are rising and working conditions are improving and they're offering more attractive benefits, that's bad. Now, I understand why that might be bad from an employer perspective, but it's not at all clear that's bad from a societal perspective. When people have worked hard in school and then get a good job, that seems like what you want, and that their wages go up. But also, it seems like it's short-circuiting the kind of market mechanism that we would want to have work, which is things, STEM jobs. Well, we don't have enough people. Got to pay them more. Got them offer more benefits and working. Doesn't it seem as if that's the other thing? It's sort of like putting your thumb on the scale of employers in a way that prevents more people from going in if that's happening.
Yeah, I think that's the goal of having a healthy market. And that is that workers and companies both benefit. There's a mutually beneficial relationship between them. And as the company prospers, the workers prosper, and the workers are going to drive that. And what you're looking for is improved productivity. The way to achieve that is through breakthroughs, but also through investing in employees and workers. And what we've seen is that none of these companies really do any workforce development, meaning they're not reinvesting into their incumbent workers, the workers that they're employing now. They're not training them. They're expecting those workers to go and get their own certifications, or they've offloaded it. They've basically socialized by offloading it to government to subsidize the education and training to meet these skills. And that, I think, is a broken market, and people should be looking at that. And the reason they're able to do that is because they've got this ready, large reserve army of foreign workers who can come in and work for less and worse working conditions.
Yeah. I mean, just as an aside, this isn't really required a comment, but look, every statistic, I'll say this at the outset, every statistic in economics is almost always debated, right? Especially complex ones. But there is a lot of evidence that in the U.S. labor market, capital has taken an ever larger share of GDP, and that all the productivity gains, or most productivity gains, seem to be going to firms, to those who own capital, rather than workers. And it seems like this kind of thing is consistent with that employers, for a variety of reasons, not just these programs by any means, that in the U.S. labor market, things seem to have advantaged the owners of capital at the expense of workers for quite some time now, and that you see them getting a larger share of GDP. So.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And this is something where I don't think there's good research on it, but somebody should do a study on. In the early to mid 90s, there was, a dot-com bubble. And part of the sort of social contract between employers and workers was, hey, we're going to work you lots of hours, but we'll give you stock options. And so you'll get, if we go public, it's almost like playing the lottery to some extent. But a large share of the employees, direct employees, got stock options. My understanding is that that's a much narrower number nowadays. The other thing that doesn't make sense, if the shortage argument was there, if there was really a shortage, is there's large share of the employment of these major companies, Google, Facebook, and we could go all the way down, Microsoft, all of these companies. They have a lot of contractors. So they outsource a large share of their work. And those contract workers are not getting the same kind of benefits that the direct employees would have. If there really was a shortage, people wouldn't take those kind of contract 1099 jobs or working for a job shop or an outsourcing company. They'd want to work directly for a Google or a Facebook.
Yeah. Well, I could talk, forever about wages and lack of labor shortage, but there are many other topics to cover, but that's all great stuff you're giving us. Let's discuss guest worker programs. I know it's an area you've focused on a lot in your career, so let's talk about that. You have argued in the past that guest worker programs should complement rather than compete with the U.S. labor market. And second, the government must protect guest workers from exploitation for exactly the reason you mentioned at the outset, that they have fewer rights than citizens and permanent residents. But you've also said the government has failed on both of these counts. Could you talk about how and why?
Yeah. So the first thing to understand again is that these guest workers have far fewer rights than you or I, a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. And the exploitation of guest workers happens whether it's in the U.S. at high-skilled H-1B or lower-skilled H-2B or H-2A, whether it's in the U.S. or in the United Arab Emirates, right? There are guest worker programs there. So guest worker programs, by their nature, are really vulnerable to abuse and exploitation of those guest workers because the employer has an incentive to take advantage of the weaker bargaining power and rights of those guest workers. So that's where government needs to come in, is to ensure and to protect that these programs are not exploited and that the workers themselves are not exploited. This is the responsibility of the government to do that. And the government has not done that in the U.S. And I'm not saying it's an easy job to do, but this is the primary. If you're going to design a guest worker program, you've got to be laser focused on ensuring that there are strong protections that are in place. The reality is that, and we could talk about the H-1B, the reality is that those protections are not in place. And that harms all workers. It harms the H-1B workers, the guest workers themselves, because they're underpaid and exploited and threatened. And then that has a knock-on effect of also harming U.S. workers who are competing then with those guest workers. And we can talk about the complementarity versus substitution if you'd like to.
Well, let me follow up a little bit. The thing that I find puzzling is it wouldn't surprise me when a Republican administration is in that they don't take the enforcement of the rules so seriously. But I think it's fair to say that Democratic administrations have not been as quick to devote resources, efforts, and priorities to going after employers who are clearly violating the rules. It's very, very uncommon for a company to be excluded from the program for past violations. And I'm surprised by that. Whereas I'm not as surprised that the Republicans would be not so quick to enforce the rules and just sort of say, let the market kind of work kind of thing. But the Democrats haven't really pushed that as hard as I would have guessed. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah. So, I've tried to work with people across. I do policy. I don't do politics. And so as much as I can, and I've worked with people on both sides of the aisle and, nonpartisan. So I would sort of push back a little bit on the focus on enforcement, because it's not just enforcement. It's the rules themselves are written in a way that invites exploitation. So if I'm an employer, it's completely rational for me to prefer an H-1B worker over an American. Why? Because I can pay them below market wages. Because Why? Because the Department of Labor has set the minimum wage, something called the prevailing wage, for those H-1B workers much lower than the market wage for U.S. workers. So I have a financial incentive to hire an H-1B worker over an American worker. I also have control over that worker. So unlike permanent resident, you or I could quit our jobs. We don't have to leave the country. A guest worker on an H-1B, they don't hold the visa themselves. They don't hold the right to stay in the U.S. themselves. That permit, the employer holds it. So that means that the employer could threaten that worker, hey, you're not doing what I'm telling you to do. And the worker can't speak back because if the worker does, they get laid off, they get terminated. They have 60 days to find another job or leave the country. And it's not easy for them to find a job. So there's enormous power that's given by the government to the employer to create this unequal playing field for those guest workers. And that's all legal. And that's because the rules are written so poorly. Now, some of it is in statute, what's written by Congress, but a lot of it's in regulations, what's written by the executive branch. And both, Republican and Democratic administrations had the power and authority to fix those rules, but have chosen not to.
Yeah. It does suggest that when it comes to the rulemaking in this area, as is true a lot of times, that in some ways the regulatory regime is captive to the perspectives of the business community and not very sensitive to the perspectives of the workers.
Yeah, and this is a revelation for me working in this area. I mean, I teach public policy, I teach public administration, but the amount of work and effort that goes into looking at what goes on in Congress, in the academic world, I mean, that's where most people are focused, as opposed to really the way things that impact real people is on the rulemaking side, is on the executive branch side. And let me make this a little more concrete. I mean, just to give you some examples, we've had dozens of cases that have been reported, and there's hundreds more, where U.S. workers have actually been forced to train their H-1B replacements. There was a case in Florida a few years ago at Walt Disney World, where 250 information technology tech workers who worked for Disney were forced to train their H-1B replacements as they were given the pink slips out the door. University of California did this with 80 IT workers. I mean, I could give you dozens and dozens of cases that have been in the news media. So it's not a theoretical thing that businesses will somehow decide not to take advantage of cheaper indentured workers. And by the way, the H-1B workers themselves call themselves in a state of indentured servitude. That's their own description of their status. So you can't blame the employer for taking advantage of indentured workers if it's going to create more profits for them. Now, you might look at, again, askance at them because of the moral reasons, but their profit motive is what it is, and the government's looking the other way. The government has the authority and really responsibility to do something about this.
Yeah, and obviously, particularly for the larger companies taking advantage of it, whether it's directly or through contractors, which is very common.
I mean, take the case of Disney, right? I mean, Disney is all about reputation, and they were willing to take the reputational hit and still replace their workers.
Right.
And the University of California, this is an educational institution, replacing its own STEM workers. And the head of the University of California at the time was Janet Napolitano, who was former DHS secretary and knew how the program was being exploited when she was in office under President Obama, and was even asked about it in Congress, and still went ahead, even though the whole congressional delegation from California, including Senator Feinstein, wrote letters saying you should not do this. So imagine the profit incentive even of an educational institution to take advantage of exploiting this.
Yeah. Can I ask you very briefly, this is a little bit inside baseball, but I think, can you remind me, because I cannot remember and I should know the answer, for people who do OPT, you might want to say what that is, isn't it true that the payroll tax for them is structured differently? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the optional practical training is something that was sort of created out of thin air administratively without Congress being involved. And when an international student comes in, they're generally coming in on what's called an F1, F as in Frank, 1 visa. And so that allows them to come and study. If they study here, they can work for up to a year. They get work authorization for up to a year on something called optional practical training. That's just the name. They're still on an F1 visa program. Now, the optional practical training program, the plus side is that the individual holds the work authorization. The downside is they still have to find an employer who's going to employ them. Now, because it's considered it's in kind of a netherworld, they're not really employee. I don't know the exact legal reasons, but they don't pay payroll taxes. So when you and I work, we pay something called FICA taxes. We pay Social Security, Medicare, all the federal insurance taxes. It ends up being about 7.5% on our side, and then our employer pays 7.5% roughly. So it's about 15%. Well, in the case of OPT workers, they don't pay payroll taxes and their employers don't pay payroll taxes because there's no expectation that they're going to get Social Security or Medicare, right? These are insurance programs. But what the effect is that those workers are going to be 15% cheaper than a recent U.S. student who might be looking for that job, a recent college graduate U.S. student. So automatically, the government is subsidizing the employment of that OPT worker at the expense of U.S. workers, U.S. recent college graduates. And that seems disturbing and problematic. There's lots of other problems with the way the OPT program is administered.
So let's be clear. Basically, if you hire one of these OPT people who are effectively guest workers, though technically not, then they're just cheaper by design. It's not cheating. They're not ripping off the IRS and the Social Security Administration or anything like that. It's just they don't have to pay these taxes. And just remind our listeners, remember, the employer pays Social Security and Medicare taxes for all of its employees, unless they're OPT. There are actually a few other categories like that. But I thought I just wanted to give, it always seems to me this is a really good substantive example where a regulation is written and I could see how they might think it was a good idea at one point, but very quickly it became obvious that this was going to cause some fraction of employers to prefer OPT to American college graduates. But it's allowed to stand. And remember, this is an example of something, you could make a constitutional argument that I guess the Bush administration, was it the first Bush administration created OPT or was it George W? Wait, who did it?
I think it was in the early 90s. It started as a pilot program.
Yeah. So that administration created it. Whether they actually had the authority to do that is a discussion for constitutional lawyers on another day. But it's certainly this regulation where people don't pay taxes and are explicitly cheaper workers, giving them a significant obvious advantage over similarly skilled native-born people, seems like the kind of thing that should have been fixed, that we could have fixed. Again, it doesn't require legislation. It just requires a rewrite of the regulations. And neither Democratic or Republican administrations have saw fit to do it, even as the program ballooned in size. It's a fascinating case.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case where the government is putting its thumb on the scale, distorting the labor market in favor of foreign workers over U.S. workers.
Yeah, and again, it could have been fixed. It could be fixed now, but there's just no appetite to do that. It's truly amazing. All right, well, I guess one question I wanted to ask is when we look at the workers who come in under H-1B, can you talk a little bit, the idea behind the program or the way it's often sold is these are very highly skilled people, the best and the brightest. But do you think that that's what's happening? Is that what research, remember, just to remind us a well-established fact, people who go to school in the United States, foreign-born, let's say foreign students who get a degree in the United States, those students, when tested on things like mathematics, tend to score very similar to Americans who are educated in the United States. But surprisingly, I always find surprising that foreign educated individuals do not tend to score that high, surprisingly, which I would have guessed on something like mathematics. So an H-1B, there are lots of circumstances, but are heavily foreign educated individuals. And so is it giving us the best and the brightest as the idea goes?
Yeah, so if we just take a step back and say what the H-1B program is for the listeners. So the H-1B program, it's called a specialty occupation program. But as we discussed what the eligibility criteria, what makes you eligible to be for an H-1B, there's nothing really special about what that minimum requirement is. But basically, you need at least a 4-year degree or equivalent experience. So a bachelor's degree, whether you earned it here in the U.S. or you've earned it abroad. And it has to be in an occupation that typically requires a bachelor's degree. And that's a wide variety of types of jobs. It could be school teachers, it could be journalists, any white-collar job that you can imagine that requires a bachelor's degree is eligible for the H-1B. So there's sort of two pieces here. One is the job itself has to be eligible, and then the second is the worker has to have the qualifications to fill that job. But that threshold is set so low that it's basically any white-collar job is up for grabs. I mean, that's a large share of the U.S. labor market. And so what happens is you get large numbers of these H-1B workers who come in every year, about 120,000. They can stay for up to 6 years, really 3 years, and it gets renewed. We have a large pool of H-1B workers here. I mean, it's a very large pool. It's 600,000 or so. Nobody knows exactly because no one's tracking whether people are returning, whether they're converting into a different status and whatnot. So this is a problem with the government. But if you look at what they do and what wages they earn, what you find is that a good share have no more than a bachelor's degree, and most of them are being paid at below the median level, below the average level wages for their occupation in their geographic location. So all the evidence shows that these are very ordinary workers. They're not bringing anything special. And in many cases, they're being brought in because they can be paid less and they're indentured. That doesn't mean that everybody who comes in on an H-1B is below market. There are many very talented people who come in on H-1B, and it is a pathway for really some of the best and brightest. But to say that the H-1B, that even the majority of people on H-1B are the best and brightest, is wrong. I mean, the evidence shows that they're no more than ordinary. They're paid no more than ordinary wages. And so this is a problem. And the government could fix this also because the program is oversubscribed. So there were 400,000 applications for 85,000 slots last year because we have a cap on the annual number that can come in. And instead of picking the best 85,000 out of the 400,000 through highest wages or education level or whether they were educated in the U.S., we give everyone a lottery ticket and we pick them randomly. So you're guaranteeing yourself, and I could get into how companies manipulate the lottery system and everything else. You're guaranteeing that you're going to get a mediocre, definitely not the best and brightest out of those applicants who want to come in on the H-1B. So we've made these mistakes over and over again, but it's not us making those mistakes. I mean, we know about this. It's not like ignorance. It's that the business community, university community, the lobbying groups like the status quo. They don't want the program to be fixed.
Right. So that you opened it up. So I just want to ask you a little bit about that. The willingness of seemingly a progressive institution like the universities who use H-1Bs seemingly often to displace their American workers or to keep wages down is one of those sort of, I'm less surprised when I hear business doing it. But it is troubling that it's not more of an issue. And as you point out, it's been pointed out to them, but it doesn't seem to resonate so much. And I wonder why. I guess when profitability is involved, everybody's kind of myopic in a way.
Yeah, so universities make money selling education, and they've figured out that they can sell access to the labor market. So there's lots of master's programs that have been created, graduate level, short 12-month or 18-month master's programs that are probably not of real high quality. But what they're doing is the universities are making money from that. And the students aren't really coming for the education. They're coming because they know that they'll get preferential treatment in terms of getting access to the labor market, to the U.S. labor market. So you're really selling landed status as opposed to education. Now, why do university administrators and their associations lobby in this way, even though they know that there's harm that goes on both to H-1B workers who are being cheated out of wages. There's rampant wage theft. They're not being paid market wages. They're being exploited, as well as U.S. workers. Those elites maybe are just so disconnected from what the reality is. I think there's a lot of groupthink that goes on. And of course, if you follow how lobbying takes place in Washington these days, it's certainly the people going up to the Hill and representing the companies, but it's creating coalitions and then marketing. So you hire political consultants, you hire PR firms, you hire academics and other think tanks to then, do studies that promote, a particular point of view. I can't tell you exactly why they're doing this, but the other important thing is that there isn't the countervailing forces. So there's no organized interest that's representing U.S. workers here. There's actually an organized interest that represents the H-1B workers, immigration voice, but there isn't really an organized interest that represents U.S. tech workers or U.S. white-collar workers in general.
In general, yeah. Was there anything else you'd like to add just about the topic, or what people should think about in the future moving forward?
No, I think what's important, and I've worked at this for a long time. I mean, we know what the problems are. We know what the solutions should be, can be, and they're there. Passing legislation is a hard thing to do. And usually, if you're going to get any kind of reform, it's got to be attached with some other goodies for industry and universities. It's a lot easier to block legislation than to get it forward. I mean, that's policy 101 in the U.S., the way our system's set up. But there are administrative actions. So there's policy guidance. There are rulemaking that can be made. And in fact, there are a lot that have been proposed, but were pulled back, that would raise wages, that would be good for H-1B workers and would do less distortion to the labor market for U.S. workers, be good for all workers. There's ways to get rid of the so-called outsourcing loophole where, U.S. workers would no longer have to train their H-1B replacements. These are all things that the executive branch can take. The Trump administration tried to do some of these things. The Biden administration has done none of it, pulled back on some of those rules that were done. So, I'm optimistic in the sense that, there's clarity on what can be done, what should be done. The question is whether you get an executive branch that will do anything about it. And unless U.S. workers start to speak up about this, nothing, unless you put pressure on people, nothing will be done.
Yeah, that's always true, isn't it? Well, I want to say, Ron, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for your dispassionate and thoughtful approach to the issue. If people want to read more of your work, where can they go?
So they can go to my website at Howard University. I also have some papers and congressional testimony that's on the EPI website at epi.org, Economic Policy Institute.
Yeah, I would recommend his congressional testimony quite a bit. I've been reading it recently. And finally, do you have any social media that we might be able to plug for you here?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Ron Hira, RONHIRA at, and then I'm also in LinkedIn, but I can't say that I'm an expert in how all that operates.
Gotcha. Well, thanks again, Ron. It was great having you here.
Thank you.
This has been Parsing Immigration Policy, and we'll be back next week with another original podcast.